Hello. It is Tuesday, February 27th, 2024, and I have the distinct honor of presenting my esteemed colleague, Matt Gaspers of Catholic Family News, to continue our discussion initiated last week on the Catholic Mass and the liturgical reform of the Second Vatican Council. Hello, Matt.
Hi, Bob. How are you doing today?
I'm doing pretty well. I've been fighting a little bit of a chest cold for several weeks.
Oh, my.
And yeah, today I feel good though. And Linda Gaspers,
Yes,
that's the same name as you, Matt.
it is. That's my mother. Hi, Mom.
Okay, so it's all in the family here. Brad
Yes.
Price, hello from Cincinnati. And the sound is really good. Okay, so things are going well. Antonia, hello from sunny Belgium.
All right.
All right. And Belgium is along the Rhine River or near it.
Yes.
And we'll be talking about the famous book by Ralph Wiltgen, Father Wiltgen, whom I knew, who said the Vatican Council can be conceived of as the Rhine flowing into the Tiber.
Hmm.
And that was the title of his book. And what he meant by that is that the theology and wisdom and interest of the Rhineland countries, particularly Germany, Holland, Belgium, was moved forward into a prominent place at the Second Vatican Council and became influential.
Hmm.
And the Tiber is the river passing through Rome. And so the
Yes.
waters of the Rhine intellectually and spiritually flowed into the Tiber and influenced the Second Vatican Council. We're going to try to see how that occurred and what it has meant for us for 60 years now to have the new Mass, which is a reformation of the old liturgy, and what all the effort is being put into now to almost eliminate the old liturgy entirely. And these are concerns of many of our viewers, and we're trying to go step by step in a reasonable way, in an
Hmm.
analytical way, to see what happened, why it happened, and where we are now.
Yes. So maybe just to give our viewers a recap of what we talked about last Tuesday, February 20th, we were covering ongoing efforts to suppress the traditional Latin Mass. As an example, we talked about what's going on in the Diocese of Austin, Texas, where the Vatican has essentially directed the bishop of that diocese. His name escapes me at the moment. I think it's Vasquez, if I remember correctly.
Mhm.
He's been told that he has to shut it down in the cathedral there. The last day I think they'll have it is March 19th, the feast of Saint Joseph. So we were talking about those continued efforts, and we reviewed and evaluated Pope Francis's reasons for doing what he's doing, as found in Traditionis Custodes, and also especially the letter attached to that motu proprio addressed to all the bishops of the world, where he lays out his rationale. And folks can watch our episode from last Tuesday for a review of all that. Also importantly, we discussed Pope Benedict XVI's landmark motu proprio Summorum Pontificum and the attached letter to bishops, in which Benedict emphasized, and we emphasized last time, what earlier generations held as sacred remains sacred and great for us too, and it cannot be all of a sudden entirely forbidden or even considered harmful. Very
Right,
important.
right. Okay, just to set it perfectly in context for people, the Second Vatican Council, 1962 to 65. I was a little boy at that time. The 60 years passed by, about 50 years passed by, and the Reformed liturgy was um, ever more celebrated throughout the church, but there was a group that remained attached from the very beginning all the way into the 21st century. And Pope Benedict XVI, who had followed these events himself, he was at the council, in 2007 produced Summorum Pontificum and said what you just said. What we have regarded as holy and as venerable in the church cannot be regarded as evil. So let's
Hmm.
allow the old mass to still be celebrated.
Hmm.
And that was his thought, and he said that. But many bishops were upset with him, and they thought that he was sort of creating two levels, like a high Catholic and a low Catholic, or an old Catholic and a new Catholic. And so there was a considerable reaction to him doing that from the more progressive bishops in the church, and they thought he's setting us up for a kind of divided church. We should try to work at some point to overcome and just have one right. And that view has been accepted by Pope Francis. So
Yes.
in 2007, Benedict resigned. In 2013, Francis was elected. Francis,
Today, actually, sorry to interrupt, but today is actually the anniversary of his final general audience, February 27th, 2013, Benedict's last audience.
okay, 11 years ago.
Yep.
Yes. And in those days in February, as he gave some of his final talks, he also spoke to the priests of Rome. And in that, he went for almost 2 hours without a prepared text around the middle of February, 11 years ago. And he
Wow.
said, "This is my sort of spiritual testament to you about my memories of the council and what's happened since." And he said there
Hmm.
were two councils. He said there was the council as it was and the council of the journalists.
Hmm.
Now, if there were two councils, as he said, one of the last addresses that he made, he went through it very great detail.
Hmm.
He said the council wanted to be in continuity while progressing forward into a more kind of updating to the modern world, but it didn't
Right.
really want to break with the past. But the journalists presented it as desiring to break with a hidebound sort of incense past that was
Mhm.
not able to come out into the sunshine of the modern world. And they said, this is a great moment. The church is having a revolution. And he said, we didn't intend that. Truly, we wanted to be in continuity while updating, because the modern
Mhm.
world is proceeding very quickly with technology, communications, finance, everything, globalization.
And
And
I
the
think
church.
I
Mhm.
was just going to say, I think as we'll see today, there were two camps. I think there were some, I think it's pretty much an established fact that there were some council fathers who did, I don't know if they wanted a complete break, but they certainly um, were not too, I don't know what the right way to say it. They weren't too concerned with maintaining tradition in its fullness, I guess you could say. I mean, they were willing to make some compromises, certainly. Some of them were more extreme in that regard than others.
Well, you're absolutely right. And in a way, Pope Benedict was being a little ingenuous when he said that we really did want everything to be in complete continuity, because there were people quite clearly who did want some sort of a new church, a new Catholic church that wasn't connected with many elements of the previous 1,960 years.
Hmm.
So there is a battle over how to interpret that needs to continue. You can't deny it. You have to say, what
Right.
was it? Yeah.
And I think I know you covered this in the magazine back in 2011, if I recall correctly. There was a very important petition sent to Pope Benedict from a group of like 50 scholars, theologians. Professor Roberto de Mattei was among them. We're going to be quoting from his important history of the Second Vatican Council today. But basically, they were calling for a re-examination of Vatican II in light of tradition, and they brought up specific passages from specific documents of the council and asked Pope Benedict, how can this be reconciled with what the church has always believed and taught and practiced?
Yeah.
And they were very respectful in their tone. They approached him with great reverence as the vicar of Christ, and unfortunately, for whatever reason, he either didn't know about it or didn't choose to respond to it, which was very tragic.
Well, there's a lot of missed opportunities, and human life is a kind of veil of tears. And there's many occasions that we could weep, even in our own lives, when something that we have an opportunity for one moment, maybe to reconcile with someone and speak with someone, explain something, and we don't do it, and it never gets done.
Right,
So we have another hope that there's a better world, there's a heaven ahead of us, because we have a lot of suffering here. And
right.
I think it would be wrong of us to say that we just tunnel under the ground here and put our heads under the sand and say there's no problem.
Mm-hmm.
I spoke with these things about with Pope Benedict himself when he was Cardinal Ratzinger on many occasions,
Mm-hmm.
and he was known for being someone who would grapple with these questions. And what's been a kind of disappointment to me, um, and I've met and talked with Pope Francis, and he's asked me to pray for him. He said to me, "Thank you for the book that you wrote about me,
Mm-hmm.
and I need to ask you one question." And I said, "Sure." He said, "Will you pray for me?" And I said, "Of course."
Mm-hmm.
But somehow I do pray for him. But I felt that the decision he took in July 16th, 2021, so it's after the COVID year, it's during sort of the
Right.
lockdown or vaccination year, and 2021, he gets a report from his liturgical advisors, and they tell him the traditional mass is a problem. Benedict tried to solve the problem by allowing it, but it's growing groups of sort of very conservative Catholics who are becoming rigid and opposed to your agenda of reaching out and embracing people and teaching, witnessing of Christ to people, and therefore you have to do something to restrict the old mass.
Mm-hmm.
Somewhere in there, I believe he received the wrong advice. There were people who advised him that he needed to write Traditionis Custodes, which is of tradition the guardians. It's kind of a
Right.
funny title
Yeah.
for a document that says we must restrict the old mass, we must close it down, we must put it away from the parish church. When the discussion and debate could have gone differently, in my view, and the interpretation of the reaction of the bishops to the survey. In other words, this thing was prepared and a survey was sent out. They knew that they needed to have an argument and documentation, but there were other arguments to be made, which we can make, which are opposed to what they told Pope Francis, on the basis of which
Mm-hmm.
he wrote Traditionis Custodes. Unless there's bad faith all around here, because the end result is that these families, very attached to the old liturgy with many children, now have to drive 100 miles and pretty soon may not be able to find anywhere to celebrate the old mass.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a lack of pastoral care and almost a cruelty in taking it away when Pope Benedict had said it's a legitimate aspiration. These people have a certain affection, and there's nothing wrong with the old mass. So,
Right.
what really is the question here? If this project to diminish and set aside the old mass argues there was something wrong with it, I would say that's not true. I would say that's heretical.
Mm-hmm.
But they avoid saying that. They say it was unwieldy. They say it was not understandable. They said repetitive. And that's why we're going to try to go through this entire process leading to the promulgation of the new liturgy. And we'll find there too. The reason I'm willing to do this and believe it's legitimate for us to do it is that in the church, these things go for decades and sometimes centuries.
Mm-hmm.
There's no problem with the Catholics using their brains and analyzing things and saying, well, Pope Benedict said this. Now we're saying something a little bit different. He's passed away, and the attack on the old mass has increased tremendously. What are the reasons for this? And is there
Mm-hmm.
some reason here that's improper? And
Right.
if we find it, we can say it.
Yes. So maybe we can start with an address that Pope Francis gave a couple weeks ago. This was on February 8th of 2024. I think we even have a slide of a photo of him giving the speech. And
Ah,
there it is there,
yes.
yes. So that I think it was in the Clementine Hall. Yes, Clementine Hall.
So
I've never been in there, but have you been in that room, Bob?
I have. It's the largest meeting room not too far from the Sistine Chapel,
Okay.
where the cardinals sit around the edges. Across directly from us, you can see Cardinal Turkson, the African cardinal.
Mm-hmm.
and Father Lorenzo Sapienza, the guy to the side of the Pope's chair,
Hmm.
who in fact is a very important figure in the Vatican. He kind of handles every single ceremony.
Okay.
Decides, yeah. So the Pope
So
is
let
sitting here speaking to the cardinals
right.
just over 2 weeks ago. So this is very
Yes.
it's very new.
So I'll read this quote from towards the beginning of his address, and the purpose of his address was to talk about. Well, he's addressing all the members of the Dicastery for Divine Worship and the Discipline of the Sacraments, first of all, and he says to them, let me get the quote here, 60 years on from the promulgation of Sacro Sanctum Concilium, which is the Vatican II Constitution on the Sacred Liturgy, the words we read in its introduction, Francis says, with which the Fathers declared the Council's purpose, do not cease to enthuse, he said.
Hmm.
They are objectives that describe a precise desire to reform the church in her fundamental dimensions. This is Francis speaking. And then he gives a list summarizing the first article of Sacrosanctum Concilium.
Hmm.
To make the Christian life of the faithful grow more and more every day, to adapt more suitably to the needs of our own times those institutions which are subject to change, to foster whatever can promote union among all who believe in Christ, to reinvigorate that which serves to call all to the bosom of the church. He went on to say, it is a task of spiritual, pastoral, ecumenical, and missionary renewal. And in order to accomplish it, the Council Fathers knew where they had to begin. They knew there were particularly cogent reasons for undertaking the reform and promotion of the liturgy, which was another quote from the document. And this paragraph ends by him saying, it is like saying, quote, without liturgical reform, there is no reform of the church. And
Yeah,
that's the quote that's on the screen. So those
there's
are pretty significant words from Pope Francis.
okay. First of all, when you said enthuse, I almost got the impression that there was another hand in the writing of this document, like an English person who uses. We are enthused by that, but of course we're reading a translation of a text that he read in Italian. But nevertheless, at the Vatican dicastery for the liturgy, they were preparing this meeting, and it could be that they drafted a text that is the text the Pope read, and
Right.
that's led by Cardinal Arthur Roach,
Yes.
who is from England,
Hmm.
and he's very interested in dialogue with the Protestant churches and with the Anglicans, and he does speak Latin himself and reads
Yes.
Latin quite well. I attended the last Easter, the vigil mass, and he was the celebrant for the
Hmm.
Pope, in place of the Pope, and he spoke in Latin.
So
But
someone else who was at this meeting who's pretty high profile in our country, kind of I would say the mouthpiece of Pope Francis in many ways in the United States, was Cardinal Blaise Supich. I
actually,
think
I think that's
okay,
Supich there, here in the front. The third man over was Supich,
yeah, I think that's probably the case. Yeah.
right there.
So after he got back, so he went to Rome for this meeting. When he got back home, he published an article through his archdiocesan newspaper. And he said at the end of that, basically, he's just representing what the Pope said to his local people in his diocese. And he said, uh, absent our celebration of the Reformed liturgy, we risk impoverishing the Christian way of life and the life of the entire church. And then many people took that to mean, okay, so Cardinal Supich, are you really saying that the traditional Latin Mass somehow impoverishes the church? Because that's crazy.
Now you're getting polemical, but this is precisely the point. Yeah,
Yeah,
he seems to be suggesting that,
right.
and you think that's a crazy suggestion.
Well, yes, to put it frankly.
So,
Yes, because
so
I mean, how, because as Pope Benedict said, what earlier generations held as sacred remains sacred and great for us too. It cannot all of a sudden be entirely forbidden or even considered harmful. And that seems to be the message they're trying to communicate, at least in my
okay,
reading.
so we have a contradiction, and we can rely or cite or turn to Pope Benedict XVI and say what you said comforts us. because we do still venerate this old tradition. But
Right.
what is now being said is that by not celebrating the new liturgy, we impoverish the faith.
Hmm.
So right there we have two different views which are in conflict. And so our
Right.
task is to probe a little more deeply here.
Right. And I'll just mention in passing, we don't have a slide for this, but so a little bit, I guess it was almost a year after Traditionis Custodes was released. That document came out July, as you said, July 16th, 2021.
Right.
In June of 2022, Pope Francis released an apostolic letter called Desiderio Desideravi, which was intended for the liturgical formation of the people of God, I think is the full title of it. And he
Yes.
also he also in that document he also brings up Sacrosanctum Concilium, the legitimate the liturgical reform born out of Sacrosanctum Concilium, um, a document that expresses the reality of the liturgy intimately joined to the vision of the church so admirably described in Lumen Gentium, et cetera, et cetera. So for all these reasons, he ends this paragraph by saying, referring to Traditionis Custodes, I have felt it my duty to affirm that, and then he quotes the liturgical books promulgated by St. Paul VI and St. John Paul II in conformity with the decrees of Vatican II are the unique expression of the lex orandi of the Roman Rite, which is this claim that he made in Traditionis Custodes. So we see it's all connected back to Sacrosanctum Concilium, which is the document we're going to discuss today.
Okay, precisely. Desiderio desideravi is a quotation of Jesus himself. He said,
Hmm.
with desire, I desired to celebrate this supper with you.
Yes.
It's the Last Supper.
Yes.
And so Francis is uh, is publishing a document in 2021 and saying we're going to restrict the old math. That was July 16th, 2021.
Hmm.
It's almost 3 years ago. It will be in July. It will be 3 years. In 2022, in June, so almost 2 years ago, he gives his argument, really, his extended argument for why he did that.
Right.
And now, 2 weeks ago, he seems again to come back to the same point. So what we have in three different occasions, but there's so many more, when Francis has taken his authority and placed it behind the argument that the new liturgy is the liturgy of the Catholic Church, and the old liturgy somehow it's got something that is no longer important and perhaps even somehow negative.
And I mean, how I read what he says, and especially what Cardinal Supich has said, and Cardinal Roach, we covered this in our show last week. They seem to be implying, even more than implying. I mean, they're basically just saying it outright that the traditional Latin Mass is incompatible with the new vision for the Church put out by Vatican II. I mean, that seems to be the claim that they're making.
Okay, so that's the claim. The question would be if that claim is wrong, then we should explain why, and then they should meditate and reflect and perhaps make an adjustment in their
Right.
thinking. Because I do feel there's something that they have not taken into account and that they're mistaking here. And
Hmm.
either they're in good faith or they're not.
Right.
And what is the key to that thought on my part is the fact that Benedict XVI, who's the supreme pastor of the church for 8 years
Hmm.
and the supreme doctrinal of the authority of the church for the prior 24, for 32 years, therefore,
Hmm.
the leading teacher of the church, did not seem to feel the same way, wrote that he thought the old liturgy was of tremendous value, great beauty,
Hmm.
and was a treasure for the church. Therefore, somebody is overthrowing his thought
Right.
and trying to cast it into the past. And I think we need to defend his thought and show why what he said is correct. And therefore,
Certainly.
not for us perhaps, but for 10 or 20 or 50 years from now, this is what we're working for.
Yes, absolutely. Well, before we went live, you were telling me you had some insights about Sacrosanctum Concilium and
Yeah, I have
something
the
about
text. I
yes,
have the text right here. This is the document Sacrosanctum Concilium.
yes. It's a
Or
lengthy
Concilium.
one.
Yeah, it's long. It's about 30 pages. And I read it the entire thing yesterday. And it's the Constitution on the Sacred Liturgy. So it's all about the liturgy.
Hmm.
And it solemnly was promulgated by His Holiness Pope Paul VI on December 4th, 1963. So we're going back 2023, 2024 now to 63. It's 60 years. Is that
Hmm.
correct?
Yep.
23 years and 30, uh, 37 is 60 years. So the council gathered in 62. They didn't produce any documents. John the 23rd died in early 63. Paul VI was elected. And
Hmm.
his first great decision was to continue or not continue the council. There was even the possibility that they would have closed the council and never have produced a single document. And he made the decision to let's call everyone back, we'll continue. So the second session was 63, the third session 64, the fourth session 65. And
Hmm.
the very end of that session was the great document on ecumenism, relations with the Jews. That was the final weeks of the council after 4 years. But
Hmm.
the first document that came out in December 4th, 1963. It was on the liturgy. And they wrestled with it, and there were conservatives and there were progressives, and they tried to say, what is the Lord bringing we bishops to promulgate with our understanding of the liturgy? And that is described in this document in great detail.
Hmm.
And as I read the document, I said, I can sense here in the passages of this document three main different voices.
Hmm.
The first are people who say, the liturgy is so wonderful. It's our prayer to God, our adoration of God, our thanking God, our coming
Hmm.
together as a community, the body of Christ, to thank Him for saving us, for the resurrection from the dead. All
Hmm.
these 2,000 years, our forefathers have carried this faith forward. That's that's why we love the liturgy. We keep the Lord's Day holy. We
Hmm.
want to remember Christ. But the liturgy became a little bit distant from some people because it was in the Latin language, and people didn't know
Hmm.
Latin anymore. And then it was a little bit distant because the priest had his back turned to the people, and he was moving up on the altar, and they didn't know what he was doing, so they would sit maybe and pray the rosary. They didn't know what was understood, what was really happening in the liturgy. And therefore, this first voice said, we need mainly 2 points. They said, we want to help people participate more in the liturgy, know what's going on, and therefore will allow more use of the vernacular language, whether it would be English or Japanese or whatever,
Hmm.
and not impose Latin on every word. Certainly, first of all, let the readings be in the vernacular, in the national language, and then let some other passages be also in that language. But it's still said in this first voice, let's keep Latin as the principal language. That's what this
Hmm.
document says. And of course, we've gone far beyond that, and we hardly hear a word of Latin in the new liturgy. But they wanted it because it was a venerable language. It was used by centuries of Catholics and many, many saints. And it was a unifying factor so that you
Hmm.
could go to Japan as a Catholic and go to a Latin mass. And
Right.
because if you go there now in a kind of globalized world, this is increasingly true, you can't understand it.
Right.
So the opposite result. So this first voice is a quite reasonable, thoughtful, professorial, and holy voice. It's all throughout this document. Let's make the Mass somehow, let's make a few changes so that the Mass will be somehow shared and appreciated and understood better. Then there's a second voice that really is emphasizing the necessity to uh, escape from a kind of mindset that's not modern. There's a second voice in the document saying the modern
Hmm.
world is filled with all these changes, and the mass is kind of like an old tugboat that's carrying the people at 3 miles an hour with a kind of mystical, mysterious language and
Hmm.
gestures. And we need to kind of open it up and open like as landing at the dock and open up to the sunshine and allow more participation. But this was a
Hmm.
cultural, this is a move, this was a cultural view which I sometimes think was the 60s mindset. And it may have related with the interests of certain globalist groups already forming at that time.
Hmm.
And therefore, I think we could say it was a time bound view, even though they were arguing it was a very open view towards the modern world, because it wasn't. People now are saying some of these more progressive liturgists and theologians are still stuck in the 60s and 70s. And they can't realize that things have continued to change and that the liturgical reform that was called for in the 60s and then implemented through the 70s with communion in the hand, etc. This was never, nothing in this document says communion in the hand or stop
Right.
kneeling. But there is a general sense that this second voice wants to get rid of things that are traditional because they want to be modern.
Yeah.
But they don't realize that modernity is a very brief time and we're all calling ourselves postmodern now.
Right.
So they're stuck in the past.
Right.
So our service to the church, frankly, is to be more open-minded than these progressives.
Yes. I think another very crucial aspect that a lot of people don't realize, because it's frankly, I think it's been hidden from the average Catholic over the decades, past decades. So just so people understand, when Pope John the 23rd announced that he was going to have a council, which was in January of 1959, the
Yes.
following year in June 1960, he established something called the Central Preparatory Commission, which was in charge of preparing schemas or draft documents for the council. And they did their work very well. They were under the supervision of Cardinal Alfredo Ottaviani, a bastion of orthodoxy at the what used to be called the Holy Office, the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. And tragically, and by design, of all the schemas or draft documents prepared by the Central Preparatory Commission, the only one that survived what has been called a progressive coup at the beginning of the council was the text on the liturgy. And the reason for that is explained by Professor Roberto de Mattei in his book, The Second Vatican Council: An Unwritten Story. I think
Yes.
we might have a
Just
slide that shows the
yes.
book cover
Just
for that.
just one thing. The fact that this Pope was elected in 1958 after Pius XII died
Hmm.
in that very contested election, because there were people who did wish that Cardinal Siri be elected.
Hmm.
He already, 2, 3 months later, in January of 59, as you rightly said, he announces he wants to have an ecumenical council. So
Right.
clearly, there was a major element of his election. I think, I think it's clear
Hmm.
that he would move forward in this direction, and that was what his pontificate would be distinguished by.
Right.
And it was the question of bringing the church up to date.
So this issue of all the schemas, and I'll explain how that happened briefly in a moment. The only schema that survived what many have referred to as a progressive coup at the beginning of the council was the text on the liturgy, because, as Professor de Mattei explains in his very important book, the cover is on the screen. I highly recommend it.
Yes.
It was the liturgy document was, quote, the only one that satisfied the progressives. The schema on the liturgy was in fact the product of the work of the one commission, so the individual commission under on the liturgy that was operating under the purview of the Central Preparatory Commission, The liturgical commission was the only one that was dominated by progressives, made up primarily of exponents of the Central European liturgical movement. So, what do I mean when I say there was a coup at the beginning of the council? Essentially, John the 23rd opened the council October 11th, 1962. 2 days later was the first general congregation or working session of the council, and that's a very important date, a Fatima anniversary, the anniversary of Our Lady's final apparition at Fatima, the miracle of the sun,
Oc-
etc.
October 13th. Yes.
Yes, 1962. And essentially what was supposed to happen that day was the bishops of the world, they assembled in St. Peter's Basilica, and the primary purpose for that first meeting was for the council fathers to elect representatives from among themselves to
Oh.
serve on the various commissions in charge of examining and finalizing the schemas prepared by the Central Preparatory Commission.
Okay, good, Matt. I just wanted to say this
Yeah.
is inside St. Peter's Basilica. In
Yes.
other words, there's 2,500 bishops there from around the world.
Hmm.
There's journalists occasionally. There's podiums for observers. There were Orthodox observers, and there were some Protestant observers.
Hmm.
That's the altar there in the back. They put in scaffolding, and what do you call them to put the chairs?
Oh, like what, risers or something?
Risers, and the Pope is there sitting in the front. He's presiding.
Hmm.
But it all depends on what you're hearing, and they were giving their speeches in Latin, and a lot of people already then didn't know Latin very well. So what I'm
Right.
gonna propose to you is that the work of the council did occur in the basilica, in the sessions, but
Hmm.
it really occurred outside, where people would have their meetings in the evening or early in the morning over coffee, say, "What are we gonna do today?"
Right.
And there was a group of over 600 more conservative bishops here, and then there were these groups of theologians more progressive from the Rhineland region flowing
Hmm.
down into the Tiber, and
Right.
they were meeting morning and night to direct this, and these sessions went from October to December, just 2 months, October, November, and then they would finish in early December and head home for Christmas.
Right.
And this first session was supposed to be the only one. And the schema of the Curia had been prepared for 2 years. And,
Correct.
and the first decision
to
they,
to
yeah,
the point, I think that they weren't expecting much work that would need to be done after
exactly.
the
Yeah,
amount of work put in already.
yeah,
Yeah.
you would say, well, maybe there's this phrase we want to change this sentence, perhaps inopportune. Let's change it or eliminate, but we'll take the document more or less. And
Right.
they made the first great decision was we won't take any of the documents, we'll write them ourselves.
Right. And the reason why that happened is because on October 13th, 1962, as Professor De Mattei explains in his book, I'll just read a brief passage. There was an unexpected scene. Cardinal Achille Leinart, Archbishop of Lille, one of the
Achilles.
oh, okay, Achille, one of the 9 presidents of the assembly
And he
addressed
was he was from one of those Rhineland countries.
yes, a French cardinal addressed Cardinal Tisserant, I think Eugene Tisserant, who was presiding over the proceedings, and Cardinal Leinart said in a low voice these words: "Your Eminence, it is really impossible to vote this way. In other words, to decide who's going to be on the commissions." Without knowing anything about the most qualified candidates. If you allow me, I ask to take the floor. Cardinal Tisserant replied, "Impossible," because that was against the rules of the council that they had already set. He said, the order of the day does not provide for any debate. We are meeting simply to vote. I cannot give you the floor." Uh, but that didn't satisfy Cardinal Leonard. De Mattei says he literally grabbed the microphone and read a prepared text stating that the fathers were not yet acquainted with the possible candidates and that it was necessary to consult the national episcopal conferences before being able to vote for the commissions. And that set in motion a domino effect where all the work that they had done over those 2 years, other than the document on the liturgy, ended up being thrown in the trash. And I just want to read something to you from Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre, who ended up founding the Society of St. Pius X, but he was actually appointed to the Central Preparatory Commission by Pope John the 23rd while he was still the Archbishop of Dakar in French-speaking Africa. I think it might have been in Senegal. Forgive
Yes,
me if I forget
that's
the
right. Yeah,
exact country, but
people forget he was a missionary for many
yes,
years, and then the Africans really admired and loved him and felt of sort of a teacher
yeah, and
for
not
all of
just.
us.
I mean, he was a profoundly effective and successful missionary, probably the greatest missionary in some regards in the 20th century in the continent of Africa. I think we might have a slide of him, Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre. So
Yeah,
this is what he's. Go
Matt,
ahead.
I'll just tell you, Cardinal Theon Doom, who came from Senegal, who's dead now, about 25 years ago, said to me once, in another 50 or 60 years, Marcel Lefebvre will be canonized.
I believe it. I
So
believe it.
we have to keep the long view, Matt.
Yes. So this is what Archbishop Lefebvre, and he's often associated, being very against the council, but he was on the Central Preparatory Commission, and this is what he said. Through the preparatory commissions, the individual commissions that were under the Central Commission, the council was preparing to proclaim the truths opposed to these modern errors in order to drive them from the midst of the church for as long as possible. It readied itself to be a light in today's world, which it would have been had it used the preconciliar texts in which were found a solemn profession of sound doctrine concerning modern problems. So, in other words, he was very hopeful about the results of the Second Vatican Council if it would have been based on those original schemas. But
Mm.
all of that work was thrown in the trash, other than the document on the liturgy, which ended up becoming Sacrosanctum Concilium. So, very, very important background information.
Well, Matt, it's a minefield here because um, we don't. Yeah, I appreciate very much, and you are doing a splendid seminar here on all the important issues. But my father once said to me, Bob, please, because he thought I was becoming conservative.
Oh,
But he studied for the priesthood himself in the 1940s, and he was a daily routine out in Callicoon, New York. And then he got married, and I was born. But my uncle was a priest. Actually, he's behind me here in the picture, and he was a Franciscan
mhm,
who had also been a U.S. Marine. So that's my background. And
sure.
the my dad said, however, the old church was wonderful, and it gave us the means of salvation, but there were some things that were problematic, and don't over idealize it or make it into an idol just because it's old. He said
Mhm,
there were some ways we were over scrupulous, some ways we were sort of ritualistic, some ways we were sort of neurotic, and there were things that they would commit a sin and they would sense their despair, and there was a necessity to do some things to make the spirit of the Holy Spirit and the message of Christ not just you're going to be damned, but you're going to be saved, and not just you're evil. You've got to confess everything about yourself
mhm.
as dust and ashes and
And my
fallen.
my understanding is Archbishop Lefebvre himself was fully on board with that. I mean, he recognized that there were some legitimate reforms that needed to be made. But what he was not in favor of was the revolution that ended up happening
Okay,
in some regards. I think that's
I think that's an accurate statement, and I do think that because I was actually alive then, I have a voice that's legitimate, and
of course.
I met and knew Pope Benedict, and therefore I think the question of the renewal of reform, semper reformanda, we say the church always is
Hmm.
needing reform.
Right.
This will be carried on. So it's like the bark of Peter goes a little bit this way, it becomes perhaps conservative, it goes there's the struggle. Maybe we've become too close, so they open up a little more progressive. They forgive people. This goes back centuries and centuries. These are questions that have emerged in the past.
Hmm.
The Donatists in Africa, the whole question of Jansenism, etc. The role of the Jesuits and how sometimes they seem to be the wonderful strength of the church, and other times they become inclined to take the idea of the ends justify the means or something, which cannot be
Hmm.
accepted. So the debate will continue, and you're going to be a major figure long after I am gone.
Well, we'll see what God has in store. Yes. Um, yeah. So, and I just also wanted to mention I have the. So I think we have a slide for the book, "The Rhine Flows into the Tiber." Since we
Right.
mentioned that at the beginning, we could bring up that slide. And Tan Books a few years ago published an updated. I mean, it's still, as I understand it, that's a picture of what the original book looked like, and this is a copy of the newer edition put out by Tan. They're calling it now "The Inside Story of Vatican II,"
Okay.
formerly entitled "The Rhine Flows into the Tiber." But
Oh, there you go. And they probably shouldn't have changed the title, but
I agree.
Tan Books is a great publisher, and
Yes,
people should actually have this in their archive so it won't be canceled completely. And I
absolutely.
knew Ralph Wiltkin.
Hmm.
He visited me in Connecticut, visited my father, spent a day, and I asked him one question. I said, "Is your book true?" And he said, "Absolutely. I stand by every single thing that I say there. I wouldn't have written it otherwise." And he was a man of pure character.
Yes.
And
And Professor De Mattei quotes and refers to Wiltkin's book pretty frequently, so it's a very important source as well. So,
I would say if you want to know and study the Vatican Council, you should begin by reading this book.
mhm.
And it's a lot to know, and there's hundreds and thousands of people and bishops. But this Ralph was there during the council, and
Mhm.
he was covering it as a very young man in the press information office, and so he was watching it every single day.
So now that we've given some background, do you want to go ahead and look at some of the texts
Yeah,
from
yeah.
Sacrosanctum Concilium? I think we have some slides ready that, yeah, so we'll just start at the beginning. This is the one that Pope Francis paraphrased a couple weeks ago. Do you want me to go ahead and read it and then we can
Sure.
discuss it? Okay.
Sure.
So this is the opening lines of the document itself. This sacred council has several aims in view. It desires to impart an ever increasing vigor to the Christian life of the faithful, to adapt more suitably to the needs of our own times those institutions which are subject to change, to foster whatever can promote union among all who believe in Christ. And then there was also something about bringing basically all of humanity, doing whatever we can to bring all of humanity into the church.
Okay. This is when I mentioned before I saw three hands in this document, and I said the first was a thoughtful Catholic of goodwill who says
Hmm.
we may need to update some things.
Right.
And the second was someone who really wants to revolutionize things to be modern.
Hmm.
But I said that modernity is now already seems passe. And but that hand you can see in the document. And the third one is this hand here. This last words promote union among all who believe in Christ. There was a group, and it could be that there was a part of this thinking in everyone, because everyone wants Christians to be reunited. But the idea of reaching out to the Orthodox, but particularly to the Protestants in Europe, who were very powerful in the northern European countries, and
Well, and the ecumenical movement had gotten very popular among the Protestants during the early 1900s, right?
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, and people were thinking if the world is secularizing, if the modern world is becoming sort of post-Christian, if we're going to treat Sunday like every other day, if we're going to do all the secular things that have happened in our society, the Christians should get together to try to hold on to Christendom. And the
Hmm.
thought was that the liturgy could do that, and that Protestants didn't like so much the priesthood as another Christ celebrating the Mass. They wanted it more a community of people who were baptized into the body of Christ, who had kind of a presider. This was a Protestant idea.
Right.
And the church wanted to go as far as it could in these last yellow words. This is the third hand that you can see in every few paragraphs of this document. And for reaching out to the separated brothers, we will try to do this. So
Mm-hmm.
I find the document composed of these three streams.
Mm-hmm.
The well-intentioned person who wants to make the mass more available to people,
Right.
the kind of radical progressive who wants to kind of leave the past behind, and the ideological ecumenist who wants to do what they can to get rid of every barrier with the good hope of having Protestants return to the Mass and to the church.
Right. So maybe we can go on to the next slide. I think should be article a quote from Article 14, if I remember correctly. There we
Yeah.
go.
Yes.
So this is from Article 14, and again, it's a very long text. We don't have time to cover it obviously in full. We're just kind of giving you some highlights. In the restoration and promotion of the sacred liturgy, this full and active participation by all the people is the aim to be considered before all else. So I think it's very important to recognize in Article 1, we see a very ecumenical intention is clearly stated, and here we see the what they call the full and active or actual participation by all the people is to be the highest priority.
Mm.
What do you
No.
think?
Well, you've raised a central point. What is participation?
Right.
Is it standing up and starting to do a dance? Uh, well,
And
and
actually, in Article 30, the text does get specific about what active participation should look like. It says the people should be encouraged to take part by means of acclamations, responses, psalmody, antiphons, and songs, as well as by actions, gestures, and bodily attitudes. And at the proper times, all should observe a reverent silence. So I think, I mean, in Article 30, I think with the psalmody probably is the kind of the in germ form, the responsorial psalm.
mhm.
I would imagine that's in the new mass, stuff
Yeah,
like that.
I mean, I think we can discuss all these things, but participation, I think ultimately the preponderance has to be spiritual, and
Absolutely.
therefore you can be silent,
Yes.
and you can be meditating on your parents or your childhood or on some sins that you've committed,
Right.
or on the trouble facing your country, but
Right.
you know that the priest is recalling Christ and bringing Christ present again to
Right.
us in all of his suffering and all of his resurrection triumph. And this is occurring in this mass, but you're sitting there and you're genuflecting and you're kneeling and you're joining in the prayer, but your participation is a kind of spiritual communion with the entire mystical body of Christ, all this history, which you are
Right.
one sort of node or one vortex, one person with one life, with all the others present as well. And you feel a brotherhood and a sisterhood, but you don't want to be disturbed by a continual participation in some type of a format of a play or of
Right.
so I don't know if we fully understood what it would mean to participate, and if the silent participation has been. I think Benedict speaks about this on some occasions. That it was set aside as irrelevant. So
Mhm.
even the old woman praying the rosary while the mass continues, they treated that as no participation at all.
Even though Pius XII taught exactly the opposite in just a little over a decade earlier than this document came out, in Mediator Dei in 1947, he specifically said that the faithful, I'll paraphrase, the faithful can part, they don't have to be following in a Roman missal. They don't have to be, have a perfect understanding of the liturgical rites or formulas. They can adopt some other, now I'm quoting, they can adopt some other method which proves easier for certain people. For instance, they can lovingly meditate on the mysteries of Jesus Christ, probably by praying the rosary, or perform other exercises of piety, or recite prayers, which, though they differ from the sacred rites, are essentially in harmony with them. So a very different teaching from Pius XII.
Well, you've pointed it out, and therefore I think it's a subject that can be investigated and studied, and people can write about it, and I think we can expand our understanding.
Sure. Well, Bob, we're getting close to the hour mark. We might have to continue this discussion
Well, let's
in a
try.
future show. It's up to you how longer you want to go, but
I would like to go just a couple more minutes because we're coming to a turning point, aren't we?
sure. Oh, we said hello, Chris from Cheshington, UK. Very good.
Okay, just let's bring up one last thing. We have one figure. Deborah, can you bring up Archbishop Bugnini? Hold on. Oh, I don't think Bugnini's here.
There
There
he
he
is.
is. And yeah, I tell you, Archbishop Annibale Hannibal Bugnini, 1912 to 1982, secretary to the Preparatory Commission for the Liturgy at Vatican Council II. So this man came into the Vatican already in the 1950s. I think he was there in the late 40s,
He
and I
was, yeah.
and uh, he becomes the topic, I think, of our next conversation, Matt.
I think
Because what he
yes.
does is take this Sacrosanctum Concilium, which was passed and promulgated in December of 63, with this call for active participation. And in 64 into 65, 66, 67, he authors or is in charge of authoring with a small group of liturgists
Mhm.
the new mass that is celebrated today.
And maybe if I could note in closing a very interesting detail. Again, a lot of people don't know probably know this about Bugnini because they associate him with the new mass. John the 23rd actually was not a big fan of Bugnini, and he actually dismissed him
Hmm.
from the liturgical commission that was preparing uh, the liturgical text for Vatican II. But then John the 23rd died. Paul the Sixth was elected, who had formerly had been Cardinal Montini, and he reappointed Father Bugnini at the time to the liturgical commission. Bugnini had a direct hand in drafting Sacrosanctum Concilium, so he's a very important figure to understand about in all of this discussion. So yeah, I'd love to pick up the discussion there sometime soon.
All right. I think we should come back and carry out the further investigation of the liturgical reform, which, of course, is always aimed at finally our own interior conversion and our participation in the effort of Jesus Christ to save the world.
Mhm.
We are facing many problems, and I think we do need to stay with and in the church and stay close to Christ as we face terrific challenges in the months and years ahead.
Yes, and one way people can do that and stay up to date, of course, is subscribing to your publication inside the Vatican magazine, and also Catholic Family News, the publication that I work for. We work very hard by God's grace to put together a monthly physical publication, which is something else that's seems to be going out these days, but it's very important, especially with the cancel culture online. It's important to have hard copy resources still.
Okay, that's a great point. So, Catholic Family News, thank you for mentioning Inside the Vatican magazine. And we very much appreciate every viewer. And if you like it, click the like button. I think there's an algorithm that helps
Hmm.
send out news about our existence if you do that. And if you
Yes.
want to subscribe, you get that. You, there's no cost, and you can unsubscribe, but you can subscribe and get a notification every time we're going to be coming on. All right,
All right. Well, until next time, thank you for having me on, Bob. It's always a pleasure.
Matt, you're an outstanding student of all of these questions, and I'm learning from you. Thank you very much.
God bless you. God bless everybody who's been watching. Take care.
So I'm going to exit. Goodbye.
All right. Bye-bye.